Welcome to Establish the Edge. I'm your host, Mike Leone. Thank you for tuning in. A couple weeks off, was on vacation 1 week. We had Thanksgiving last week, but this week we're back. And it might seem random, but we're talking best ball here towards the end of the season. I think it's a fun time to look at what's worked for best ball teams so far in the big tournaments and kind of try and preview what teams are set up to be in the best shape come these big playoff weeks and these big contests on Underdog, FFPC, and Drafters. I was chatting with Eric Beimfor on a Twitter thread last night, and we were discussing the Underdog Best Ball Mania tournament and sort of the pros and cons of trying to advance to most teams versus trying to be somewhat unique and different things like that. So pretty excited today to have Madison Parkhill, writer for RotoViz, on the show. You can follow him on Twitter at Madison Parkhill. And he was in that Twitter discussion with us. And Madison, thanks for joining me and ready to talk some best ball?
Yeah, the rare exception here where we get to talk best ball during the regular season before we've got through the rest of fantasy. But as I like to say to many of my friends, it's always best ball season. So very happy to be here. Thanks for having me, Mike.
Let's hope the FBI does not break down any of our doors because we know it is illegal to talk best ball during the season. We're going rogue here. We're recording this live, but hopefully it flies under the radar, Madison. But yeah, I think it's interesting to review in general best ball. Like, it's been kind of a crazy season, and I know every season's chaotic, and something Ben Gretsch, who I do a lot of analysis with, he's always saying is like, we tend to forget how chaotic each season is, and then it happens again and we're like, well, there's chaos. With that said, I feel like there's been a little bit more. There's been different stretches where it seemed like different guys were quote unquote league winners. We had Derrick Henry, and then he goes down. Cooper Kupp had a really hot stretch, and he's still looking pretty good, but cooled off a bit. Deebo Samuel now is hurt. Swift's hurt. We've had a lot of quick changes in things. So I don't know. It's been a little bit wild, but any just top level takeaways, just based on the ups and downs of the entire season so far?
Yeah, it's as you noted, I think it's a running bit that Eric and others have done now where we said, oh, this guy's a league winner. Oh, this guy's, Mike Williams through week 3 is a league winner. And then Mike Williams doesn't score a touchdown for however many weeks. So, yeah, to Gretsch's point, we do forget, especially when you're drafting your best ball teams early in the summer, you forget how chaotic it's going to be. I think we've definitely seen that. And I think it's for a format like Underdog or FFPC where you have to get into the playoffs at the end. I think that chaos has some pretty unique implications for that, for the best ball teams in the big tournaments. So, yeah.
Yeah. And we're going to be focused a little bit more on the tournaments as we're discussing here versus the regular leagues. And if you are in a regular league, it's like, well, you've banked kind of those maybe stretches that you've gotten some really hot streaks from. But for tournaments, you kind of want the really strong team towards the end. But yeah, I know. And even like we did a show today on the Established to Run rest of season top 150, and we were looking at tight ends, and it's kind of crazy. Like some of the best tight ends weren't drafted a ton in terms of value. Dalton Schultz, Pat Freiermuth at the back end of the draft, and top end of the draft, some of the tight ends, really went pretty badly. Like they've almost all, with the exception of maybe Mark Andrews, disappointed the top 6 tight ends, right? Hawkinson, Pitts, Kelsey, Kittle, Waller. I mean, they've all disappointed, but at the same time, if you've got, Kelsey and Kittle going into the playoffs, you're feeling good because you have this edge that other people don't. So it's pretty strange. I almost think, Madison, there's this tight end dead zone to an extent. We talk about the running back dead zone, but it seems like those top 6 guys, as bad as they've been, they've at least been somewhat stable with the exception of injuries to Kittle. And I think like getting that stable amount of points each week is part of the reason why they're so valuable in best ball, because it's like they can have these really disappointing seasons and it sort of doesn't kill you. Whereas you start taking these guys around 7 to 9, I think that's where the opportunity cost is. Like we could make some better bets on some other positions that have a little bit more upside. And these tight ends at the end of drafts, like Hunter Henry and the guys I mentioned in Freiermuth and Dalton Schultz, the range of outcomes might not be all that different than us taking, Noah Fant in round 8 or Tyler Higbee in round 8. I am cherry picking a little bit with the names that I'm using, of course.
Yeah, I think that's one of the big differences, at least for basketball, is that you can't pick up, Foster Moreau now is probably startable these next couple of weeks with Waller out. You can't do that in best ball. You can in the regular season, but still the elite upside of those top 6 guys is not really matched by anyone you're going to have on your best ball roster. That said, I think that I remember Zach Reason did a study where the breakout tight ends were often tied to elite quarterbacks. So I read that and I thought, okay, well, maybe Dawson Knox, the Donald Parhams, the Dalton Schultz and Blake Jarwins, those are the type of guys. Even Zach Ertz at the time might be a type of guy to target, as disgusting as that is to say and what's to say then. Those are the type of guys where in best ball, if you're able to correlate that and you're able to stack it, those guys have a lot of upside now because of Dalton Schultz might be able to match a Kyle Pitts or somebody like that down the stretch here. And then you have a huge edge of those teams that went Pitts in the 4th or 5th round or Hawkinson. So I do think that will be pretty unique. And we could see that be unique where a Dawson Knox, Josh Allen stack or a Dak Prescott, Dalton Schultz stack. Those type of teams might be well positioned here towards the playoffs of the big tournaments.
Yeah. And, one of the things we often talk about, I know Eric Beimfor, who I did a show with in the off season. People should definitely check that out. I'm sure we'll do another one next off season, talk about the best ball tournament strategy, but sometimes just assuming the opposite of what the market's assuming. And that got me a little bit on Dalton Schultz, where for whatever reason, everybody was just thinking, okay, Blake Jarwin. And we didn't really, Dalton Schultz had an okay year. Jarwin was coming off an injury. If anything, we almost should have thought Schultz was ahead and not Jarwin, or at least had it 50-50. And, the ADPs didn't bear that out. So I got on some Dalton Schultz. Dawson Knox was a pretty big whiff. Do have him on one of my better FFPC teams, thankfully, as I think he was literally like an 18th round pick in FFPC, and that's tight end premium. But as you said, tied to the elite quarterback, a lot of times we're just, at this point, I mean, even in DFS, we're just like, can a guy score a touchdown for me, please? Like, that's all it's going to take to get it done. So why not, tie with one of the quarterbacks most likely to score the most touchdowns. So I think that was a mistake. And I do want to kind of pivot into, on our personal teams, Madison, like things we think we did well, things we think we did poorly. I guess we can start. Let's start with the positives first. We'll be optimistic. We'll make ourselves feel better before we get too pessimistic. I think for me, I was content with the way that I really focused on structure a little bit over, kind of the micro analysis. And within those structures, I did some extreme strategies, which I think make a lot of sense. Like zero RB, where I'm drafting like 6, even some teams with 7 running backs, because I'm just so absolutely loaded at wide receiver early. But then like doing the reverse of that too. Like I've got a really strong FFPC team where I took 4 running backs in the first 6 rounds, and that was it. And I think those strategies, I don't want to get too far ahead, but I think those extreme strategies allow you to not only help your advance rates, because I think you're utilizing your draft capital in the best way, and you're also building like smart teams where you're just willing to accept losing if a couple things go wrong in the positions that you invested in premium picks in. And if those premium picks don't work out, you're already behind the 8 ball if those picks don't work out. So like just maximizing around that those picks go well. But then what that does is, as you're entering these playoff weeks, some of these big contests, if you're a hyper fragile team, you drafted 10 wide receivers, you could have some receivers that nobody else has because they were, pretty bad in the regular season, but because you drafted 10 of them, they didn't really squash your, that team's ability to advance. So I liked focusing on those strategies, and within that too, like being at least somewhat cognizant of ADP. We have our own rankings at ETR, but our best ball rankings do incorporate a certain percentage of the ADP into them. Part of that, so you can build super teams, like, the order to take guys based on the odds of, getting guys later. But part of that's just like, acknowledging the market is, if we're that far off the market, we might be missing something. So I don't have a lot of shares of guys like Leonard Fournette and and Devonta Smith, who we'll get into a little bit in the mistakes section. But I at least have some because I was willing to take guys, when they slipped past ADP, even if they weren't my favorites.
Yeah, I generally, at least in the underdog ones, I tried to follow ADP pretty carefully, even with having RotoViz rankings or ETR rankings up. I generally weighted more heavily towards the ADP side, just trying to build the super teams like you thought. So it didn't make me as unique, I don't think, but the ability to just take guys at value that were within structure, that, if I took a running back early, or I took a couple running backs early, not taking any more, but just kind of following the ADPs, hunting for the ADP value later on, I think allows you to maximize in the big tournaments, maximize your projection and also your edge. And then the other thing I would say is for the extreme strategies, I think one of the huge advantages of it is that less people do it, or tend to do it less. And so when you end up with, you say, the 10th round receiver, or 7 or 8 running backs, maybe you just happened upon a Cordarrelle Patterson, or somebody like that, where you normally would not have taken them, wouldn't even consider them, but it puts you onto it because you had to take a running back, and there was 5 or 10 that were all pretty ugly, but you just lucked into it. And that's a huge edge, obviously, now. So I don't know how many Cordarrelle Patterson teams there are, probably very, very few. But the ones that do have him are obviously going to be extremely well positioned to do well in the playoffs, especially given all the top end RBs that have gone down with injury late in the season.
Yeah, that happened last year quite a bit. The rookie receivers late haven't hit this year to the extent they did last year, but last year, stumbling upon Claypool, T. Higgins, guys like that. I know for me, like Ayuk, a lot of the big hits, and then even some of the boring guys. I felt like this happened more last year than this year, but even some of the boring guys in theory, like Cole Beasley and stuff last year, like I was racking these guys up primarily because I was drafting 10 wide receivers, not because I liked them, but because it's like, I need to keep filling out wide receivers. So that's a really good point. I mentioned there is less of those guys last year. I do think, less of those guys this year. I do think that might be in part due to something we foresaw, which was more people were trying that. Still not a lot, but more people were trying like the wide receiver heavy builds, which pushed up their ADP quite a bit. I know, especially on underdog, that happened. So even though you were picking kind of random guys late, they were even more random than maybe they were last year.
And that was true on drafters as well. And theirs was actually, so with underdogs, at least you had the benefit in the puppies where it was filling pretty quickly. So the ADPs you were drafting at weren't too radically different. So you could kind of follow that. But at least for Best Ball Mania, which lasted 2 or 3 months, with a lot of the early teams had the advantage of if they went running back early, then if they went JT Eckler or Zeke Eckler or Mixon, those type of teams, they were getting huge discounts at the wide receiver position compared to where they ended up. And similar on drafters, the same type of thing where I remember seeing at the time when the drafters tournament was about to fill that a lot of the grinders over there were like, I don't even know why I'm still drafting. All the ADPs have been pushed up so far that the winner's already been drafted. So that was something I thought that at least on the puppy side, where I would rather do more of those later on to try to just capture a static ADP that you could take advantage of more with just structure by the ADP value.
Yeah, the whole ADP shifts throughout the course of the season is something that's interesting, and it almost could have an entire conversation on that. But you noted in our show notes too, though, that you like the extreme strategies as well, and also making some assumptions with outsized rewards. You put down the Packers. I'm guessing that means you were on Devontae Adams, Aaron Jones a little bit before the Rodgers news broke. I think those were really sharp bets. I know Herzig was on Aaron Jones quite a bit. I was on Adams. It was just, the opportunity to get a guy at like the late second round at times who like potentially would be going 5th overall. And then you talk about getting unique combos. No one's going to be able to get the combos you got later on if the news breaks the right way, which it did with Rodgers staying with the Packers and starting week 1.
So at least with the Packers, and I say the Packers, there was really just an assumption of Aaron Rodgers. So if I was able to get Aaron Jones in the second, which actually didn't happen much early on, he was going mid-first, even though the market had Devontae as a early second-round pick to start. If I was able to get Devontae or Aaron Jones at a discount, then I was targeting Rodgers, whose ADP was pretty low. If I missed on those guys, I would either try to get either Judy or Sutton or Fant, who are just kind of, they were priced in at like Teddy Bridgewater or Drew Lock was going to be the quarterback. Well, if Aaron Rodgers goes there, then that's a huge upgrade. So really, I let those ADPs kind of define it for me, while trying to get Rodgers as much as possible. So before the news broke that he was coming back to the Packers, I think my Rodgers exposure was definitely the highest of any quarterback I had. It was in the 20% range. And then I had a lot of either Judy or Sutton, and then a lot of Marquez Valdez-Scantling, because I felt like, well, this is, even if Rodgers doesn't go there, maybe Jordan Love can throw a couple deep touchdowns. There's no opportunity cost with it. So yeah, I think those type of bets really sharp early on, where if you don't have much downside and you're really just focused on the ceiling scenarios anyways. And then the other that I was not on early on was the Darrell Henderson news with Cam Akers, where his ADP only went to about the mid-5th or early 4th after a while. And just assuming that, well, maybe he truly is the bell cow, which we've kind of seen this year, as opposed to he would split time evenly or would only be a 60% snap type of guy. Now, obviously, he's been dinged up throughout the year, so it hasn't been the most productive, but I think the process was at least right on that. And he's been solid, if not league winning.
Yeah, the Henderson one was interesting because I did a video for Best Ball Mania where I was basically like, don't draft Henderson in Best Ball Mania because so many teams already got him at a really good ADP. But the weird part that happened with Henderson, I guess there were two things. One, his ADP never got pushed up as high as I thought it might, like to your point. And two, I do think there were some people with that mindset in Best Ball Mania, but it seemed to infiltrate the ADPs. Like even in redraft, he was a phenomenal bet, where you don't care about the game theory of other people having them at different price tags and stuff. And then when Michelle signed, he fell to a point where even in Best Ball Mania, it was worth taking him again, because at that point, if I can get him in the 7th, 8th round, I don't really care that people got him in the 11th. When I have to take him in the 4th, I care people got him in the 11th, the 5th even. But then once we start getting past there, you start getting to a certain point in the draft where the hit rates are so low on guys anyways that it's not as big of a deal. So that one was super interesting to me. And then Swift, I think you and I were both kind of on Swift as, for taking a shot, especially if you were building teams like the early running back teams where you don't draft a lot of running backs, which is when I say hyper fragile running back, I hate saying that, but like just the easiest way to call those teams. Like those two, like I had some teams until Swift went down, and that could still be okay, but like I have a Taylor Barkley Swift team, it's and a couple other iterations of like Taylor Swift teams that look really good. And the Swift stuff was, a lot of times the quote unquote dead zone running backs are guys like Mike Davis, who I'm associated with, and was a complete failure and kind of a good example of why, when we try to pick exceptions, it can just be futile because he sort of had the role that we hoped he had, and the offense is just so bad it doesn't matter, and he's 100% dependent on the offense. Whereas someone like Swift has this elite talent, and in particular, just the pass catching role to kind of have it not really matter that much. So people definitely seem like they maybe got a little overly concerned on Swift injury risk and Swift. Just the fact that he was on a bad team, people seemed like really, really concerned by that, which, for a 2-down back, you're certainly concerned by, but for a guy that can rack up targets in some ways, it unleashes his upside a little bit.
Yeah, I was one of those guys early in the off season where I thought, horrible team. He's not going to score enough touchdowns to kill me, so I'll just treat him like any other dead zone back. But as the offseason progressed, started looking more of his comps, his athletic comparables that he had, what he had done as a rookie, targets per route run. I think Ben Gretsch had a thing over an article or something over the offseason where it's like, well, he was targeted at a really high rate and he was pretty efficient. So he probably can overcome the bad team type of scenarios. And so luckily, I got on him before the ADP jumped up a little bit. And then also we got the benefit of the groin injury that would not go away, and the coach speak from Dan Campbell that brought his ADP back down, especially on DraftKings best ball, which I did less of, but the ADP just cratered there to where he was going like late 5th, 6th round. And it's like, well, he's not even really a dead zone guy at that point. So, I mean, and it's PPR, you pretty much have to make that assumption that he'll be a bell cow. So yeah, he was a really unique case, I think, and one that we haven't had in the dead zone often in recent years, and it's something we'll have to consider, I think, going forward is those type of backs that are in the dead zone and the upside that they might have.
Yeah, and man, as we jump over to kind of looking at things we did poorly, this running back year is I put out a tweet. I was kind of joking about how we're going to have really measured, nuanced running back discussion, because a lot of the zero running back teams, struggle to get there because some of the most popular guys didn't necessarily hit. But at the same time, the first 2 round of running backs, it's final destination. There's just not that many left remaining as far as the best teams, left going. So, and then even in the dead zone, Myles Gaskin went from dead zone poster child to, oh my God, your Myles Gaskin looks great. And as we highlight things I did poorly, for me, I think, I had too much bias in the running back in my zero running back pool, particularly on, I think there's a group of backs that we've maybe gone too far in hating, which is kind of I don't even want to say the old backs, but like the middle-aged backs who maybe have someone younger there, someone sexier there, but they like clearly have a role to start the season. And Jack Miller did he did like a late round running back upside article for us over the offseason. And one of the big things he found was backs that have roles from the get-go are kind of the guys that you almost get more returns on versus straight handcuffs. Obviously, we know with handcuffs, if you hit on Darrell Henderson, Cam Akers goes down, you do have this 8th percentile upside that these other backs don't have. But kind of, I have my highest scoring Best Ball Mania team right now is a 0 RB team in which I couldn't find the way to pull up the draft board, but I'm assuming I just took these guys well after ADP, kind of when the ADPs went crazy where wide receivers were going so early. I have these guys that I didn't take much of anywhere else. That would be Myles Gaskin. This is the running back crew. Myles Gaskin, Leonard Fournette, Melvin Gordon, Damian Harris, James Conner, and Darrington Evans. Now, Evans, Conner, Harris were guys that I were taking somewhat routinely, but Melvin Gordon has been he was dropping to like almost the 13th round at some points, when ADPs went nuts. And that's a guy that hasn't shown a huge ceiling, but one, that outcome maybe is there if Javonte had gotten hurt. Like Javante's been healthy all year. And 2, he's had so many usable best ball weeks, where because he's finding the box, 60 yards finds the box. So guys like that, the whole Fournette thing, I really kicked myself on because I really did sort of just be like, at the end of the day, it was just kind of like, I don't want to draft Leonard Fournette. Like, I don't think
I did the same thing. I did the same thing. I got lured by the Ronald Jones. Well, what if he just goes for 102 and then next week goes for nothing? Well, I don't care because his ADP is so low that it doesn't matter. I'd prefer that type of upside. I did not think, especially with the Gio Bernard, I had a lot of Gio Bernard because I thought he could do a similar thing at no opportunity cost at all. And what we've seen is Leonard Fournette just dominate the pass down work. I mean, his target rate is incredible right now. So similar thing for me on as you say, those middle-aged type of backs that aren't very explosive, I think is one reason. They don't have a lot of flashy plays. You don't really see Leonard Fournette break a lot of big runs. Somewhat similar with Melvin Gordon. So yeah, I had very little of those guys. Now that's, I think, a pretty unicorn type team. So good luck to you in the playoffs. That's going to be I think fairly low owned since it was 0 RB and you had all three of them. So that might be a pretty unique combination that could pay off heavily. But similar for me, I was on Connor a little bit. I thought that he'd get the goal line work, and obviously he's run 90+ percentile on touchdowns there. But the other guys, I thought James Robinson was somewhat unique. He was kind of the one of the few guys I was on, just because of the coach speak about putting ETN in this weird gadget type role that maybe Robinson was worth. He was a similar bet to James Conner in terms of touchdowns. So he was on. I was on him at least a little bit, but yeah, those guys you're reading off, I had very little of myself, mostly due to bias in terms of Fournette. I will say, I think Javonte Williams, the process on him was right. We didn't get the run out, but thinking back to a pod you did last week, if Melvin Gordon's injury last week had happened when he went down, and I saw that Pro Football Doc tweeted out to he's probably not coming back in. That's the scenario for Javonte where he's a league winner, where he's catching 4 or 5 passes in a fairly productive offense where he's a bell cow type usage. So we didn't get that run out this year. But I think we was pretty close. We were just the Melvin Gordon injury away, and Melvin's been fairly injury prone over his last couple of years in the NFL. So I do think the process was right on that type of bet.
Yeah, and I 100% agree. I even think the Rojo bet was a good bet. Quite frankly, you just needed him to do. I think people underestimated what he did last year. I mean, he missed a few games. He went for 1,000 yards and double-digit touchdowns, right? Like, I think the idea is when the price gets to a certain point, like you can bet on different guys in the backfield. And with Fournette early in the offseason, I think he was kind of expensive really early. If I recall correctly, he was kind of expensive, like really early in the offseason, where I think that playoff run people were like overvaluing. But then it sort of swung back the other way where we told ourselves so much you're overvaluing the playoff run. Then when he starts going around 9-10, it's like, well, this is the highest projected scoring offense in the entire league, and he's shown that he can be a workhorse back for this team literally in the highest leverage games possible. Not that that means it's going to happen, but it's like he was the highest scoring running back in the playoffs, not the fantasy playoffs, the real NFL playoffs. So it's
it goes back to what you said at the very beginning. You're just kind of assuming the opposite of the market there. The market gave us a discount, and at least in you and I's case, we didn't take it because of some priors we had on Ronald Jones and Gio and Fournette. It's just an example of bias, I think, kind of coming in, and once the opportunity cost gets that low, it almost doesn't matter. I don't want to say it doesn't matter which player you take, but you don't want to go like. In terms of me, like going back to the Blake Jarwin versus Dalton Schultz thing, I had 18% Schultz, 2% or 18% Jarwin, 2% Schultz. Is it really 9 times as likely that Blake Jarwin's going to be the Cowboys tight end compared to Dalton Schultz? Like, no, that should be a pretty close to 50-50 bet. So you should be willing to just adapt and take either one of those guys. And in terms of Fournette and Rojo, I think that once the price got to that point, like you said, it was almost just worth getting pretty close to 50-50 again between them.
And another point, like these aren't foregone conclusions. Again, did the ETR rest of the season top 150 pod today? We talked about Antonio Gibson. He went from hitting kind of the bad end of his range of outcomes, which was 2 down back who gets banged up a little bit and isn't on a team that's as good as we thought would be. And 2 down backs in those situations just aren't that valuable. And now the team's playing better, and JD McKissick possibly misses a couple games, and he's hitting the huge upside that we thought. So like we're seeing, and that's the range of outcomes. Like one of those things could happen for the whole season. Like he could have been a complete league winner. Like that was definitely in the range of outcomes. And just like in Tampa, Fournette almost got cut last year. He could have been dust, and Rojo could have run away with it. And it could have been a Rojo 2 down back and Giovanni Bernard catching a ton of passes, and they would have both been pretty valuable. So just keeping in mind the full range of outcomes. And one thing I definitely got overconfident on, there's no 2 ways about it, is the rookie quarterbacks. I kind of made them the linchpin of my draft strategy, not just in best ball, but kind of across redraft. And I think I don't want to say it was a total mistake, because again, I don't think these things were foregone conclusions. I think Fields and Lance had a certain level of upside that they could have reasonably hit. And if they had hit it where they went, would have really changed your team, because you would have been playing, with a similar scoring quarterback to teams that drafted quarterback 3-4 rounds earlier. But at the same time, we did get to a point where the ADPs caught up on those guys, and I kind of just kept hammering it. And we'll see in a second when I go over my advance rates. They're not that good for what I had hoped. And I think a large part of that is my rookie quarterback exposure. And then things that like Lawrence and Zach Wilson are just so bad. And of course, Madison, the one rookie quarterback I didn't draft, who I would kill to have right now, is Mac Jones. I'm not going to take the guy who doesn't have any upside. And now I'm just like, God, if some of these Lance teams could just get Mac Jones level performances each week.
Yeah, I was similar. The hard thing with Mac is I couldn't figure out who to stack him with, really. I mean, it was Jacoby Myers, but like I can only take so much Jacoby Myers before I feel like I'm heavily overexposed, especially when I don't know if he's truly the number one. They spent a lot of money on Aguilar and Bourne, so maybe they don't think that they didn't think Myers was as good as maybe we did. And then there's two different tight ends, so I can take one of them, sure, but I don't know if that's right. So there's a lot of stacking issues that made me a little less likely to take Mac. As far as Lance and Fields, I was heavy on whoever was going to go to San Francisco I wanted, just because I've seen bad quarterbacks or maybe mediocre quarterbacks is the right way to say there, that they've been productive, they've been efficient. I think you talked about it before, where Nick Mullins is like 4th in yards per attempt or something.
Yeah, over the last 3 seasons, something wild
right.
like that.
Something crazy like that. So even if Trey Lance is bad, which he might be, I still think you saw the usage in his one start where he ran the ball like 10 or 15 times. He's getting the goal line work. He didn't even score any touchdowns, and he had like 12 DraftKings points or something like that. So I do think that the Lance bet was good, especially when you only paired him with maybe one 49er. So you're banking on a lot of rushing touchdowns, and then you hit the, if it's Ayuk, okay, if it's Debo, if it's Kittle. So I think that was good. The Fields one, I struggled with. Obviously, the A-Rob cratering has been difficult and pretty unforeseen, I'd say. And I didn't necessarily like Mooney's ADP. So that I took a little bit less of Fields, but he was the one where he started getting steamed at the end that I made the mistake of just kind of following the crowd there, thinking like, okay, like, he's looking good in training camp. Maybe he's the real deal. And for whatever reason, that one just quite hasn't worked out. Whether it's Matt Nagy, whether Fields is not as good as we thought. So that one might have been a mistake. But the Lance one, I'm still holding on to, as I think that was the right process.
Yeah, I think for me, it was more the how far I went with my exposures. Yeah, I've got a first place FFPC team that has Sam Darnold, Trey Lance, and Justin Fields. And I'm just like, it's a loaded team. And I'm just like, can I get Mac Jones on this team? like give me his unstacked 16 fantasy points a week. I will take it. So yeah, that's been tough for sure. Any other mistakes that you think you kind of made, or things that you think you can learn from? It's always hard to differentiate between bad luck and bad process, and something like Lance is maybe like down the middle a little bit.
Yeah, I think adapting to the type of playoff formats, like we talked about, drafters being cumulative versus underdog being the weekly format. I think that was a little bit wrong. I know we're going to talk about the specific teams and kind of the playoffs where you get the advance rate versus the unique combination in a bit. So do you want to wait? We can do that.
Let's wait. We'll talk about the that makes sense. I'll just hit real quick in the spirit of disclosure. My advance rates for Best Ball Mania, I did 65 teams. I have 12 out of 65 advancing. That is not much more than what I should get on randomness, which is 10.8 teams. Madison, you're crushing me there. You have 12 teams advancing, but in about half as many entries, 39. So you're about twice the level of randomness, which is really, really strong. I am hoping some of these third place teams of mine can come through here. The final, God, what do I got? I got 2 more weeks. Got 2 more weeks. And what's interesting is my teams have kind of held around here most of the year. I thought I was set up to kind of take advantage of the kind of chaos of the season a little bit more than some other teams, but that hasn't really happened. You know, I had a good stretch when Mark Andrews went nuts, a lot of Mark Andrews, but yeah, and I think in large part for me, even though the same thing happened to you and you've overcome it, but like, you know, making either 0 RB teams or anchor running back teams and having, you know, I think I have 1 Leonard Fournette share. It's literally my highest scoring team. It's like nuts. So yeah, congrats to you. That's a good start. Any teams in there you're particularly excited about, or?
Yeah, there's one in the puppy, the one I have in one of the puppies, which my advance rate is not as good over there. I think in large part due to the quick fill nature of those. So, but in there I had a Jonathan Taylor, DeAndre Swift team. We'll see on whether if Swift can get back in time to really be productive there. But I do have Devin Singletary and Chuba Hubbard on that team too. So if I can survive for the next few weeks and get Swift back, I'm rolling a Josh Allen stack out there that has Allen, Diggs, Knox on that. So that's pretty solid. Also with a Teddy, Noah Fant. So that one's okay. And then I had one other in Best Ball Mania, my highest scoring one that's still solid. I had one that had Derrick Henry, and we were chatting before the pod. Obviously, that one is dust. It's going to advance and it's going to lose in the first round. That's just, you know, that's kind of the way it goes. But the other one is a Zeke Eckler with 2 quarterbacks, 4 running backs, 10 receivers, and 2 tight ends. So kind of the extreme strategy that we were talking about.
Like it. Yeah.
Right. Where you make the assumption then, you know, you took your 2 top backs, and then I didn't take another one until after pick 100, where I went James Conner, Darrell Henderson. So you're right. So as long as everybody stays healthy there, I like that one. And that also gets me onto one other thing that I didn't see a lot of people talking about, but I felt that when you got 2 of that elite tier quarterbacks that were going after round 5, so kind of below the opportunity cost, that if they both went below ADP, it might be worth taking 2 of them and pairing them, and then just hammering receiver as much as possible, the max number of receivers that you can get on that. So on this team, I have Dak and Kyler with stacks.
Was that like 5-6 turn or?
Yeah, so it was, looking at it, it was pick right at 5-6 turns. So pick 60 and 61. And I already had CD. Obviously, I had Zeke and Connor, and then I came back with Kirk and AJ Green late. So there where I have another thing. The other reason that really put me onto that, I probably wouldn't even thought about it, is that they play each other in the championship week. And obviously, if Kyler and Dak are both healthy, we're probably going to have a high over/under on that. And so I kind of use that as a tiebreaker early in the offseason. And so that, I think, kind of put me onto maybe the double elite quarterback strategy without too much opportunity cost. But I think that the sample size of teams that have done that, I think, is going to be really, really low. So the unique nature of that might be pretty valuable in the playoffs. Not sure, yeah, but
there's 2 things on that. One, in some ways, it's more interesting for underdog, where I know we're going to get into the structure in a little bit, but you have these 3 kind of basically big DFS tournaments in a row that you have to like win or come near the top, you know, to continue to advance, where having, you know, if Dak has a bad week and Kyler has a really good week, now you're advancing, and most of the Dak teams are dead because most of the Dak teams didn't, you know, go double elite quarterback. So
right.
I think that's interesting. And the other thing on that point, I do think sometimes, and this goes back to the rookie quarterback thing, where I really like to draft the, you know, assume you're right and draft that way and like really maximize your max upside around a certain thing or 2 going right. But like sometimes that straps my flexibility a little bit too much. Like I get too rigid where I probably wouldn't have considered that. And I don't know how plus EV or not it is, but I wouldn't have considered it. And you should be considering things. Like I would have been like, I'm drafting Dak. I'm assuming Dak's awesome. I don't need Kyler. Move on. And, you know, I did that with the rookie quarterbacks a little bit, where like some of those teams I could have had, a third quarterback, because my quarterback costs were down, and I could have done some things to maybe like, again, you don't want to go too far because then you're not drafting as if you're right. But at the same time, you do want to be somewhat flexible and kind of try and visualize, ways this could help me or make my team a little bit more robust without maybe sacrificing some upside. So yeah, that's definitely an interesting start.
Well, and it reminds me of some of the RotoViz guys have done work, not in a tournament format, but that the double elite tight end where you go late second round, early third round tight end, or two tight ends in the first 5 rounds, that has really high ceiling and win rate. But the sample size is obviously super low, and there's probably a ton of bias in that because it's really just, a couple guys each season that's the only sample that you have. But that is a similar, I think, strategy as this, where, as you said, as long as you get one of those guys through, then you're the only one. If you had Waller Kittle, if you're the only one to get Waller through to week 15 and he comes back and goes 9 for 150 and 2, like you're almost certain to advance and be the only one with Waller again. And so that's
that makes a lot of sense. I do on FFPC, I have 3 out of 11 teams through. That's a little bit better. Randomness is 1.8. I also have 1 out of 2 of my big dog teams through. So running a little bit better on the higher stakes one. My big dog team was a really weird team where I drafted this with my friend Dan, and all year long we were like doing okay, and we didn't know how because our team kind of stunk and we just didn't. And now it looks good. First of all, we just by sometimes, better to be lucky than good. I think we would have drafted him anyways, but we forgot, Madison, that it was 20 rounds in underdog. we logged off after round 18 and got drafted Taysom Hill as our third quarterback, which we kind of needed because it's a Fields to a Taysom team. So the Fields to a navigation there for a while was
right.
brutal, but it's a Jonathan Taylor anchor team. And we've gotten, some performances from AJ Dillon. We're about to get some good performances from Alexander Madison. Damian Williams had a week in there. It is a Rojo team. Wish it was Fournette, not Rojo. But then it's Cooper Kupp team, which helps. He kind of was the only reason we were doing good for a while. But like DeAndre Hopkins, DJ Moore, we actually drafted before. And after we've gone through these teams, I guess we can kind of start talking a little bit more about the different playoff formats. And also, like, I think we all agree, me, you, and Eric, who was in that conversation on Twitter, when we're talking about uniqueness versus advanced rates versus upside, the ideal thing is like you kind of want to hit all 3. So a team like this hits it in an unintentional way on the uniqueness, just because our first 2 receivers, DeAndre Hopkins, DJ Moore, again, they're kind of busty for a lot of teams, right? But because we're going to survive, the nature of this team, Christian McCaffrey's out, that's up DJ Moore's target share. DeAndre Hopkins is coming back from injury after missing some games. Like, all of a sudden, we've got some cup teams that look pretty different than some of these other teams. But I guess the question on Twitter then was more like, are there more ways that we can get outcomes like this, but being more deliberate about it in the way we draft? And the underdog structure is so unique from the other formats, whether it's FFPC or drafters, because it's a lotto. It's a weighted lotto. Like, we're trying to win $1 million. The 3 playoff rounds are, again, kind of like 3 DFS uncorrelated tournaments in a row. It's not just one. The way that it works, you got to be kind of top heavy in all 3, if I recall correctly. And so you were kind of talking about maybe being more cognizant of unique combinations early, which is something that I've been resistant to, but I do think it's an interesting conversation. And again, even on underdog, the difference between the puppy and best ball mania, there's some differences there too.
Yeah. So, as we were talking about it, I think I'll just say the optimal way is I think we would agree, is that you're diversifying your exposures, you're drafting within structure, and you're letting the ADP value come to you. And you're naturally getting unique combinations from that because you're getting guys below ADP, and now you have a super team that's unique. That's the ideal. But what I think is interesting is that's fairly rare to happen in a lot of these. Most people are drafting similarly off ADP. It's hard to get unique combinations, especially early, because the ADP is so closely followed. So I think in a tournament that fills quickly, where you don't have to worry about ADP swings, so for a puppy, for example, you might be able to force an early contrarian combination that's much less owned. And I think that has some benefits in the playoff format specifically. So the example that I kind of presented yesterday or 2 days ago, whenever it was, is that, well, what if, a lot of us didn't like the 1.02 to 1.05 or 1.06 range. All the running backs kind of felt the same. They all had reasons that we might doubt them. But some of the guys below them were similar bets, the Austin Ecklers, the Jonathan Taylors, at that late first round ADP. What if you just went JT there, and then you came back and you took a receiver in the second round that you might have taken anyways there, so like a Justin Jefferson. So really, the only difference you have is Jonathan Taylor versus Dalvin Cook or Alvin Kamara, and you still have Justin Jefferson in the second round, and then you follow ADP and hunt for value for the rest. I don't know, as we said, I don't know. I think that's much less owned because almost no one is doing that. So you're having to give up a little bit of projection. You're having to give up a Dalvin Cook versus Jonathan Taylor to start the season, or maybe a Tyreek Hill versus Justin Jefferson to start the season, something like that. But I don't know how much really is that. So the question I posed was, well, if I asked you before the season, you'd probably say that's pretty close to 50-50 of who's going to outscore each other, whether it's Tyreek versus Justin Jefferson, whether it's JT versus Zeke or Dalvin. You'd say it's pretty close to 50-50, but I'd prefer the guy going in the first round.
Yeah, right.
But if he's not owned, if that combination is not owned at all, and now you're in a unique tournament where you're trying to win, you have to get top 2 of 12 or top 2 of 18, top 1 of 18, like you have to do in this underdog tournament. It might be worth forcing it just a little bit early on to get that uniqueness.
Yeah, it's an interesting concept. I've struggled with it because my mindset has been, and again, sometimes you have to have blinders on a little bit. It's it's kind of, I'm arguing against Eric with some of this stuff, but something he says a lot, and I don't know if Bales first said it, or who first said it, but it's strong convictions loosely held. So for me, I've been very hyper focused on the advance rates, and as a result, I'm reluctant to do that because I don't want to sacrifice my advance rate. And I've kind of felt, and what's hard about this conversation is you can sort of make logical arguments on both sides, and we don't necessarily have the data to decide. And because I was thinking, even like if you think like NFL game, we know coaches punt too much, right? But part of that's because we have the data to back that up. You can make you can say logically true, objective things about why you should punt. Like if we go for it and don't get it, where the other team has really good field position, is likely going to score. Like you can make those logical arguments. We just know that the math doesn't add up and favor that. And I feel like this conversation comes to that a little bit, and that's why it's in some ways so much fun to conjecture on. My concern is that like so much of this comes out in the wash when you look at like how many JT Jefferson teams actually advance, and then you're already going to be so unique with the rest of your roster. It's really the top guys up top. But at the same time, I'm often arguing for structure above all else. And if that's the case, maybe I should be more open to this stuff because, like you're saying, you're drafting within structure. You're just making a small pivot. So I know a couple of my projects this offseason, Madison, are one, just like figuring out the actual ownership rates of like these different combinations to kind of see like how outsized is it. 15% to 1%? Is it 10% to 7%? And then especially even in like the tournament rounds, like of the teams that advanced, what is it? Which I think would be really interesting to parse out. And then I've done some research looking at, as you sacrifice ADP value, you do sacrifice like kind of your odds of putting up a top 1 percentile score. But I'd like to do it. It hasn't done it. It's using a lot of closing line ADP. And then as a result, like there's some bad data in there. So I want to look at the actual ADPs at the time the teams were drafted. So I think those two things will help us out a lot. But I'm with you though. I think the small tweaks make sense. But I think sometimes people take it too far, which is not what you're suggesting. But like I can't get behind taking like, you know, a second round player 5th overall. Like JT was like a 1-2 turn guy kind of. I mean, there was, with the exception of when people were scared about Wentz. I'm trying to figure.
And I wouldn't, so in Best Ball Mania, when JT started going late second, I wouldn't, this is not a case where I would do that. That's too much to give up. Like a full round is way too much, especially when it's round 1 to 2. But so like kind of thinking through like when I might do this for next year. And I do think it's going to be on a relatively small percentage of my teams where I'll force it like this. And the earlier you do it, you can't, the earlier you do it, you can't really hunt for the ADP value, which we all agree is the best when you get the unique ADP value. So like, I think like the 3rd to 5th round is kind of the area to do that, where I'm already going a little bit outside of ADP there just because of the dead zone being there. So, and to take Swift this year, like if I was to force a Swift type player next year where his ADP is in the late 3rd and I force him in the late 2nd, and I know I'm going receiver there anyways in the 3rd round, and I would have gone receiver in the 2nd instead of Swift. So if I force it, like the combination could be like Swift, Keenan Allen instead of CeeDee Lamb, Swift. So I think then you're getting to the point where you're giving up less because it's happening later. You might have been able to hunt for a little bit of ADP value in the 1st or 2nd round. And then again, like you say, we don't know how owned it is or how outsized the rewards might be, but that might be a case where I think that's like the type of place where I'm going to try it just to see if I like the combinations that I'm getting there, and I think they'll be unique. But again, like you said, like you can make a logical argument on both sides. And until a couple of days ago, I would agree with you. Like I was not trying this last year in any of the tournaments. I was following ADP. I was trying to hunt for the value to get the super team that was unique. But in cases where I can't do that, I do think that this is like a small pivot that you can do in the puppy, where that it's going to fill in a week or two, given everybody's love for best ball now, where you can force it just a little bit.
Yeah, and it'll be interesting to watch. It's just it's a difficult game because the playoff weeks obviously matter so much. We're trying to win $1 million, and it's this constant struggle behind. I want to maximize my teams to take advantage of those weeks versus, well, how much control do I actually have over that? And if I don't think I have control over that, even though I agree it's important, then just get me as many teams through as possible.
Right.
And then I'll run into some teams like my like big dog team that just the combination of players works out. Now all of a sudden I've got, Madison and DeAndre Hopkins through who aren't on. So that's where it's really interesting. I do think, again, like the people who want to take like a round 3 player in round 1, like that stuff just doesn't like that's where you're squashing, and we're in full agreement. That's where you're squashing. These small pivots though probably do make a little bit of sense. And as you said, you're not doing it on all your teams, which I think is important, because if you're doing it on all your teams, like let's say, like the 102 to the 105, right? Like you mentioned that as like, we weren't sure what we wanted to do. If we took JT and Eckler at 102 through 105, we're pretty happy just because of the results, but you're like, your exposures then, and maybe you want it this way, but your exposures are going to be lopsided because there's no way for you to like get back to even on Dalvin Cook, if you passed on him. Whereas like JT and Eckler, if you're halfway through if you're doing 150 drafts, you're halfway through, like there's ways that you can, get to even on those guys. Start taking them at 107, 108, if you find your light on them. So not that your goal is to be equal on everybody, but that was one aspect to it that I was thinking about. And I think we agree though, this conversation makes most sense in best ball on underdog, particularly the puppy, where they fail so quickly and the ADP's close. Like best ball mania, there's some that you can definitely do with it, but the ADP swings so much throughout that if you're going to do it, it makes sense to do it later. Like get your ADP values early in the off season, late in the off season when the ADPs are a little bit more locked in is when you would do it. The other formats where things are different, FFPC, you advance 2 out of 12 teams just like you do on Underdog, but because it's a higher stakes tournament with less total teams, it's 3 straight weeks where 3 out of 12 advance, which is way different than Underdog. And then you're in a final that's only 12 people. A lot of this stuff, you're almost thrown out the window. Like, you just want to build as robust of a team as possible. I wonder if even, you know, some of the hyper fragile teams I did on there are even a little bit too much. Which I don't know, because I think those are actually good even for regular league, but I've got 2 teams winning with hyper fragile teams, right? But like, they both have Dalvin Cook. One's got Dalvin Cook, Aaron Jones, Mostert, Kenny Gainwell. Like, that team's limping, and, you know, I'm probably dead because round 1 I've got, you know, Gainwell on bye and Dalvin hurt, and Mostert's already out for the year. So that's, I don't know. Should I have taken a fifth back? Would have made a difference? Maybe, but that structure is clearly very different, where you're thinking to be a little bit more robust. And then the drafters tournament, in which you have a team that's 5th overall with the 10K grand prize there, that one's super intriguing because it's cumulative points. And you started talking about, you know, maybe some mistakes you made, like not adjusting to that format. And that one's like, not like FFPC, because you do want the super team, but you like can't really sacrifice points early in the season to have that super team by the end of the year, because those points all count the same.
Right. So I think I made a couple mistakes on drafters. I really only have one team that's great over there. My other teams are not very good. They're all sub. I think they're all top 50%, but none of them are top 10% outside of this one. So the mistakes that I think I made over there was the PPR format really drew me to a heavy receiver 0RB type of build, which you think would be good. Receivers are going to score more points over there, so they should naturally be pushed up. And the wide receivers ADPs were pretty low over there when I was drafting. But what you see over there, you're scrolling through the top teams and you're looking at who's there. It's just a ton of either JT and Eckler, or Eckler and Mixon, and even some Zeke, JT Swift, those type of teams that you just can't replicate the legendary upside of those guys. So on Underdog, we're talking about DeAndre Swift teams right now, or even Dalvin Cook teams, or Aaron Jones teams, those, or even Zeke teams, perhaps if his injury is a little bit worse. Like, those teams might be dead come the playoffs. They just, you may not be able to advance those. But on drafters, your lead is just so much right now over the other teams, that even though with those guys hurt, it's really, really hard for people to catch up and make up the point total. So I think over there, it makes a lot of sense to really focus on the super high ceiling type of approaches where every week counts the same. So I think the running backs are actually a little more valuable over there. So the anchor RB builds. I know that I had a hyper fragile build over there. I don't know how it did, but I remember where it was 20 rounds, and I took 2 quarterbacks, 3 running backs, and 2 tight ends, and just hammered a lot of really crappy receivers at the end. It was like one of the worst receiver teams ever drafted. But if you hit those running backs, then like, I think that those extreme strategies are even better over there. So that's just the difference between Underdog and drafters. It's really, you have to adjust for that. And that's something that I wasn't as cognizant of this last season, but I think I've recognized at least the beginnings of it, and hopefully can take advantage of that more next year.
Yeah, hopefully my 4-year-old son's going insane downstairs. So hopefully you guys can't hear that too much. Last thing before we get out of here, if you got a few more minutes, the 0RB stuff, like the running back stuff, is so fascinating to me. I mean, so an outsider would just be definitely like, well, you should just draft the best plays. Like, if you just drafted JT, Eckler, Mixon, and Myles Gaskin in the dead zone, and then you took Fournette, you're golden. But we're gonna get arrested. The FBI is coming after us.
Oh no!
For the rest of these men.
No!
But I do think like 0RB teams, especially if you didn't draft as much Fournette as me, like, you did kind of have a tough time this year where. I don't know. Maybe that's just me projecting. I felt like some of my 0RB teams had a tough time getting there, but the ones that did get there, like, I got a lot of James Conner, and those types of teams. Now, like for the playoffs for Best Ball Mania, again, very different than drafters. It looks really, really interesting, Madison, because a lot of the teams that didn't draft 0RB have just injured running backs early, and even the teams that like the JT teams, of which I have some, but like there's kind of like a central point of failure there where like if JT sucks or gets hurt, now all of a sudden we're down to like Mixon and Eckler teams. Like a high percentage of the teams that advance are going to have JT. So there's a central point of failure there. But the wide receivers early haven't hit a ton. Devontae Adams is obviously coming along, and Tyreek Hill is having a really good year. But like Diggs, DeAndre Hopkins, even like Metcalf,
Right.
Keenan's been okay. They've kind of underplayed as a group. I feel like that's fair to say. But now but in a way that's good because like if you've made these 0RB teams through, not only are the other teams in tough shape at running back, but you have this advantage at wide receiver with guys like Diggs who maybe don't have the best advance rates because they had, a ho-hum season, but they're on your team that did advance. So those teams the 0RB teams look best to me to kind of take this down if they can survive Taylor, or, there's always the anchor RB teams too, where you took literally Taylor and then, 4 late running backs or something.
Yeah, the anchor RB is always my preference, and I think that those teams are still in the best spot. Like it's hard to envision right now JT slowing down much given the schedule he has upcoming. Like obviously, if he does, then those teams are probably done. So that'd still be my preference, and there's obviously a huge advantage for the number of them versus the number of 0RB teams right now. But I do think if you had like if you're thinking back of the ADPs and you had like a Kirk Cousins, Justin Jefferson, Alexander Madison team that you've somehow advanced, which you might, with the Cousins and Jefferson side being pretty good. Those type of teams I think are really, really live to take advantage of the Dalvin Cook injury. You can have Madison replicate something from one of those elite RBs with his handcuff status, and then you're just one big Viking outburst away from advancing that ahead of time. So I think I tweeted out yesterday, kind of joking on some of the other guys who were talking best ball at the time, that I think a 0RB team is going to win one of these underdog tournaments. I don't know which one, but I think one of them is going to be won by a 0RB team, and it's going to be carnage for the fantasy industry to try to reckon with that, given that it hasn't really happened, or at least that's the common refrain you hear whenever people advocate for it as a strategy.
Yeah, I think if a heavy RB team wins, it'll be a team like Justin Herzig had last year when he won, where he snuck Kamara through, no one else had him, and then like obviously he had an outlier 6 touchdown game, but like if Swift or Dalvin miss a few weeks here and you can sneak through those teams, like then it's like, oh wow, I'm the only one in the finals with Dalvin. It's bigger this year, so there's probably not gonna be the only one, but like you could have some leverage there. I'm pretty anti-handcuffing, but that does make me think like if you had Madison, Dalvin at this point, you could kind of, like Madison's. I feel like such a perfect scenario has to play out for that to work that like I'm against it. Like I don't like doing it, but I have heard people suggest this exact scenario even in the offseason. So like not even being hindsight bias where Madison gets you through 2 weeks of the playoffs, and then Dalvin, comes home and drops the hammer in the championship game or whatever. Do you have any interest in handcuffing your own back next year?
So generally, no. I would just say that if an offense is really good, if I know that offense is going to score a lot of touchdowns, and I'm not sure I would have put the Vikings in that category, but like the Cowboys this year, I was very confident they were going to smash. So in that case, like Zeke plus Pollard, as long as the Pollard ADP doesn't rise too much, I could see myself doing that. I don't think I would do too much of it, probably just as a mix up when I'm going like full Cowboys onslaught type of things. Then I might. But generally speaking, I think it's better to focus on the upside during the regular season that can get you there and just relying on the stud to perform whenever he's there.
Yeah, obviously, you'd rather have Madison and Jonathan Taylor right now in a perfect world.
Right.
Of course, cherry picking, the best running back in all of fantasy
Of course.
always makes for good arguments.
I did that yesterday.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's a val. I mean, he's the league winner, right? The league winner, the changing league winner. He's the one now. But yeah, thanks so much for joining me. Again, you can follow Madison on Twitter at Madison Parkhill, and also follow his work over at RotoViz. RotoViz does great stuff. You can follow my stuff over at Establish the Run. We've been crushing NFL props, so if you get an in-season package, you get access to that. That's been a ton of fun to work on. And Dink and I do our tournament show every Saturday morning, Establish a Million. So if you're playing DFS, check that out. Please rate, review this on iTunes. Also give us a thumbs up on YouTube. Helps us do this type of content for free. Thanks, everybody. Good luck in all your contests.